Okay, welcome to our Sunday morning service on the 22nd of March. While this is an inconvenience, it's difficult. It's going to be a new way of doing things for the time being. We have to be aware that while this is, for us, maybe an inconvenience, for other people, this is going to be life-changing. So, we'll just have to accept for what it is, do what we can, and hopefully, things will get better and we will be in a better place because of it. But I want to do a reading first of all, because we're in series on Mark 5, 21 to 43. Jesus got into the boat again and went back to the other side of the lake, where a large crowd gathered around him. Then a leader of the local synagogue, whose name was Jairus, arrived. And when he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet, pleading fervently with him, "My little daughter is dying. Please come and lay your hands on her and heal her, so she can live." Jesus went with him, and all the people followed, crowding around him. A woman in the crowd had been suffering for 12 years with constant bleeding. She had suffered a great deal from many doctors, and over the years she had spent everything she had to pay them. But she'd not gotten better. In fact, she'd gotten worse. She'd heard about Jesus, and she came up behind him through the crowd and touched his robe. For she thought to herself, "If I can just touch his robe, I'll be healed." Immediately the bleeding stopped, and she could feel in her body that she'd been healed of this terrible condition. Jesus realized at once that healing power had gone out from him, so he turned around in the crowd and said, "Who touched my robe?" His disciples said to him, "Look at the crowd pressing around you. How can you ask, 'Who touched me?'" But he kept on looking around and to see who'd done it. Then a frightened woman, trembling at the realization of what had happened to her, came to her and fell on her knees in front of him and said that it was her that had done it. And he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace. Your suffering is over." While he was still speaking to her, messengers arrived from the house of Jairus, the leader of the synagogue. They told him, "Your daughter is dead. There is no use troubling the teacher now." But Jesus overheard them and said to Jairus, "Do not be afraid. Just have faith." Then Jesus stopped the crowd and wouldn't let anyone go with him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. When they came to the home of the synagogue leader, James saw how much commotion and weeping and wailing. He went inside and asked, "Why all this commotion and weeping? The child isn't dead, she's only asleep." The crowd laughed at him, but he made them all leave. And he looked at the girl's father and mother and all of his 3 disciples in the room where the girl was lying. Holding her hand, he said to her, "Talitha koum," which means, "Little girl, get up." And the girl, who was 12 years old, immediately stood up and walked around. And they were overwhelmed and totally amazed. Jesus gave them strict orders not to tell anyone what had happened. And then he told them to give her something to eat. Okay, first of all, quick question for you. What's your favourite sandwich? Sorry, it's a bit of a quick question, but what is your favourite sandwich? My favourite sandwich is a prawn sandwich. I love prawn and mayonnaise. So first of all, this story, I think we need to bear in mind that this is known as a Markian sandwich. So it's he does a lot of this, Mark does, where he interweaves 2 stories together. And the story of Jairus is interweaved with this story of the woman. And, we could consider the Jairus bit like the bread and the woman being the sort of the filling, the middle bit. And he does this several times throughout Mark's gospel, and this is probably one of the most obvious. And Jairus, of course, is a synagogue leader, socially respectable, a man of good character, and a man to spend time with and be seen with. The woman, who of course is unnamed, is utterly different. She is a completely different type of person. She would have been considered unclean, a person you would cross the street to avoid. And both turn to Jesus in their desperation. And in so many times, obviously, it's the story of our time. These 2 were driven into action by fear. And our world is fearful at present. We are a desperate people. And when I first read this story, I was kind of a bit worried. It's a bit too close to the bone. But in reality, it's exactly the kind of story we need to hear right now. So Jairus would have known exactly who Jesus was. He would have known his reputation. He known he was avoided by the religious, the teachers of the law, and the Pharisees. But Jairus no longer cared about his reputation because his 12-year-old was sick. And so he throws himself at the feet of Jesus, a physical posture of submission. It would not have done anything to his reputation. It would have really spoilt his PR, but he didn't care. His daughter was far more important. And as a father, I know how much I would do for my daughter. And this man did everything. So we've got Jairus. So that's what happens. He meets Jesus and he pleads and he throws himself, and Jesus says he'll go. And Jesus agrees to go. But as he does, this woman arrives. Now, she would have been, unlike Jairus, she would have been unclean in most people's eyes. She was, because blood, any form of blood in Jewish society was unclean, which meant that most women were, women, young women were clean for a few weeks every single month. But this woman had been unclean for 12 years. And touching an unclean woman or an unclean person, whatever, would make you similarly unclean. And we know that, like most human beings, we are primates and we are social, and touching is vital. Imagine if nobody ever touched you. It's actually a huge impact on our mental well-being. And so the coronavirus is a problem for us humans, because we are so attuned to touch, and where appropriate and where it's consented, touch is vital to us. From a handshake to a hug, from a kiss on the cheek to holding hands, we need to be touched. First question to think about for you, because I'm going to pose some questions for this. How have you found not being touched this week? How has it been to be socially distant from people? Okay, have a think about that later. So this woman was an untouchable. She was socially excluded, and this had been a 12-year period of isolation, and she was desperate. And so, like Jairus, she sought out Jesus, but she didn't need to speak to him. She didn't want to speak to him, maybe because she thought he would refuse to touch her like so many other people had. And but when she did reach out and touched him, he knew instantly that. And while the disciples couldn't work out how amongst all this busy crowd, Jesus could know that someone had touched him, Jesus knew something had happened. And when he asks, she approaches him with fear. But Jesus, rather than scolding her, praises her. And I think we need to be careful, aware that when a clean person touches an unclean person in that society, both are made unclean. But Jesus turns that round. And when an unclean person touches Jesus, something completely different happens. They become clean. And actually, she becomes cleaner. And in the process, she's healed instantly. And Jesus' words to her was, "Your faith has saved you." Now, that may say an incredible, simple message of salvation. What has actually changed for the woman? Has the keys of heaven been opened to her? We've often reduced salvation down to, going to heaven when you die. But here, Jesus is talking about that liberation that the woman's experienced. Not just physically from being set free from the blood, but liberated socially to be able to go around and do normal things. Maybe she could get married because maybe she couldn't get married. And maybe she could hug members of her family. She'd been liberated. She'd been set free. She has new possibilities for her life. So, question as we consider salvation, it's far, far different from the limited version that we've got. For me, salvation is about exodus, is about liberation for people from whatever thing has held them back in slavery. And for this woman, she'd been held in slavery. She'd been enslaved by her illness. So, if we think of salvation as much more than the going to heaven when you die, which it is, but it's not, it's much more. Where have you been liberated? Have a little think when you finish this. What has liberated you? So the next part of the story, we move on. Jesus goes from that woman and he's heading towards Jairus' daughter, and people come out to meet him. Don't point, there's no point. Stay away. Don't bother the teacher anymore. The girl is dead, and the mourners have already arrived. Now, what would happen in that culture was that they would, in some ways, our emotionally, restrained culture that we're in, You know, they knew how to change things. So they would send out the mourners, and they would mourn and wail and weep, and that would give the family the opportunity to do the same. Often we are, emotionally quite stilted compared with that. And they had professional mourners, but they'd arrived, and they were there to make a noise. And they immediately laugh at Jesus when he says, she's alive. He actually says as a metaphor for death, he says, she is asleep. And we still use that metaphor. We put animals to sleep. And we know they're not actually asleep. We know that something else has happened to them. But Jesus waves these mourners away, and he takes the family and his key disciples with him. What does he do? He doesn't, he doesn't stay away from her. There's no social distancing here. He reaches out and he touches her, grabs hold of her. And for me, there's a little detail here, and I think that tells us, we've talked about earlier in the season of this Mark account, is that Peter is a big influence on Mark, the writer here. And so Peter was present. We know that he was one with James and John. And there's a personal touch. He says to her, little girl, get up. That's what the word means. That's what Talitha Kum means. It means little girl, get up. And again, that element there is touch, isn't it? Jesus touches the dead body, an act that would ordinarily make him ritually unclean, but instead it makes her clean, both in terms of bringing her back to life, but also making her right. Jesus brings dead things back to life. Many people in this world are walking dead. They exist, but only in body. And I see that all around when I'm in Devonport sometimes. So, next question. Where can we be bringers of life to our families, to our workplaces, and to our local communities? That's one to think about. And both stories effectively are about faith, aren't they? To the woman, he says, your faith has saved you. To Jairus, he says, do not be afraid, have faith. And both healings are not dependent on their faith. We're not, there isn't a conditional here. Have faith and you'll get healed. And I think there's a simplicity in some churches of saying, everyone should be healed. There should be no sickness in our group because everyone should have faith. Jesus doesn't need their faith, but somehow he draws on that faith. And both would have been a mixture of faith and fear. The woman, as she gradually tries to grab out to Jesus, or what would he say? What would he do? And Jairus publicly giving himself, because his love for his daughter was more than his fear of his social rejection. And Jesus is able to utilize even the smallest element of faith. And the key thing is for us to live in faith, not fear, especially in our world now. We're in such an anxious world, and the last few weeks have been so weird and so strange. But somehow we need to live differently in this, to live in a way that exercises faith. And there are two extremes we can fall into. The Jews were expert in cleanliness laws, hand washing and bathing. And because disease was rife, they didn't have no way of projecting like how many people would die or all that kind of stuff. They just knew that there was disease out there, and they didn't have antibiotics, all the stuff that we have. So the ritual cleansing laws were as much about making sure they were all clean as it was about that. But they became a ritual. And you became, whether you were in or out, depended on whether you were obedient to those laws. And they'd lost the meaning of those laws, which was simply about, cleanliness, keeping clean. And we need to wash our hands for 20 seconds. And, several weeks in of doing that, sometimes I think, do we really need to anymore? But yes, we do. Not because it makes us in or out, but because it protects us. God is interested in us and wants to protect us. So there's that. But they had become a source of exclusion. Clean people, unclean people, in people, out people, included, excluded. But we can also go the other way. There was a church I saw last week, on Monday, in fact, on a video from Florida, whose faith meant they all shook hands and hugged. And he literally called anyone who didn't do that a pansy. That was what the pastor said. And he said, God wouldn't let anyone get infected in the church, he said. And actually, even that's just simply not true. That doesn't happen that way. We can get affected anywhere at the moment. We have to be people of faith, but also people of sense and caution. We don't have blind faith, nor do we allow rituals to dictate who is in and who is out. We need to live sensibly, which means following medical advice. It means loving our neighbour by being sensible. It also means not being driven by fear, but living in hope by exercising faith, and faith that Jesus has the best plan for us. Even if sometimes we don't always agree with the plan, we have to learn to trust that God is at work. And over the last few weeks, our world has changed, hasn't it? Sadly, so many people have already died and more will die. And we grieve with everyone who's lost a loved one at this time. And some people are struggling with anxiety. Others will suffer mental health issues due to isolation or fear. People who've seen things will struggle with post-traumatic stress disorder. Some people have panicked and stockpiled, some people have used the stock markets to make financial gain. Some people are benefiting out of this. That is not a good thing. That's not the way to react. But there's also good things. China, the smoke cloud has gone. That had been made up of pollution. It's lifted. It's gone because there's not much pollution in the air. People can see the sky again. People can hear birds again. While in Italy and Spain, people have learned to sing together. Maybe they've not sung together in years because we've become so much of an isolated people. But suddenly people are craving connection. Planes have stopped flying, which means people have learned better ways of communicating. Rather than doing that 8-hour trip to New York, you can do it over various different live streaming services. Some people have contacted their vulnerable neighbours and offered to help in any other way. That's what happened with my mum this week. Her next door neighbour knocked on the door with a takeaway saying, here's some... And when she was trying to pay, she goes, no, don't pay. Good things do come from terrible things. And the light shines in darkness, but the light is never overcome by darkness. Where possible, we'll start to build new ways of doing and being community, to genuinely love our neighbours. Faith is far better reaction longer term than fear. But faith is not easy and it needs to be nurtured. And that nurture happens on our knees in prayer. It happens with our studies of scripture. It happens when we can gather with each other and encourage each other. It happens when we serve people rather than being served. Jesus offers more than just salvation from death, but he offers us a new way of being human because he is the God-man. He leads the way. He is fully God and fully man, and he leads the way in demonstrating what humanity needs to look like. Jesus makes unclean things clean. He provides faith to the fearful, and he offers liberation to all who want it. Could have you give me a moment to pray through those things? Thank you for listening, and I hope this has been of benefit. God bless.